Hello, welcome back to our hands-on video. This is Jason Baker, and this is our third and final video in the pipeline lecture week. And this video is going to focus on CodePipeline. Now, we've covered CodeBuild and CodeDeploy. In CodeBuild, we were taking a GitHub repository and using the code in that repository to do some unit testing and to build an output artifact. We took that build artifact and stored it in an S3 bucket, our artifact repository. In the CodeDeploy service video, we took the output artifact from an S3 bucket and we deployed it to a set of EC2 instances that were located behind a load balancer. So you saw how the CodeDeploy service was able to automatically deploy that output artifact. Well, wouldn't it be really nice if we could combine those two services together? If we could essentially make a commit to a GitHub repository, and that would then trigger a build in the CodeBuild service, build a new output artifact, store it in an S3 bucket, and then the CodeDeploy service would automatically deploy that build artifact to some EC2 instances for us. Well, we are in luck because that capability is available to us using the CodePipeline service. You can think of the CodePipeline service as an AWS service which glues together some of these other services like CodeBuild and CodeDeploy. It manages the flow of our application from the Git repository to the build service to the deploy service, and ultimately deployed onto our production instances. Okay, well, let's get started. One of the first things that we're going to do is just like the CodeBuild service, we're going to do some preliminary setup work here. And so the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to fork another project. This project is called the Python project, and it's located in our class organization, the UST SEIS 615 organization in GitHub. So we're going to take this Python project and we are going to fork it. We're going to fork it into our personal account. So that is now forking the Python project into my personal account, and that is now complete. Now the project this is a Python-based web application, and so there are some Python files in here. There are also two special files that we are already familiar with based on the previous videos. There is a build spec file and there is an app spec file. So we have a configuration file for both the code build service and the code deploy service. If we look at the build spec file, what we'll see is that there are a number of phases defined. During the install phase, we're installing both the Node.js and the Python runtime versions. In the pre-build phase, we are going to do an install of some Python dependencies using the pip application to install those dependencies. And then we're going to run PyTest, which is going to execute a very small unit test suite to perform some unit testing on our Python application. In the build phase, then, we are going to install some node packages and and we're going to install some style sheets into our application location on the hosting location. So that's what the build spec file is doing, and it's ultimately then going to create this output artifact called Python app with a date timestamp associated with it. So that's going to be our output artifact that's going to end up in our artifact S3 bucket. If I go back and take a look at the app spec file, then this is going to be used by the code deploy service. So the code deploy service is going to take that package and it's going to install everything in that package into the opt/python-app directory on the servers. And then it's going to install some dependencies. It's going to run a shell script that will install some dependencies. These are Python modules. And then there is a start server and stop server script, and this will start up the Python web application and stop the Python web application. So that's what's happening in this Python project repository that we have forked into our personal GitHub account. Well, if you remember in the CodeBuild video, what we also did then was we set up a set of Git credentials. So we created a GitHub personal access token, and we stored that in AWS Secrets Manager. And we used that credential when configuring the CodeBuild service. That was the credential that CodeBuild used to go out and access our GitHub account and our Git repository. Well, the CodePipeline service, interestingly enough, works a little differently. We can't provide the CodePipeline service with a personal access token. Instead, the CodePipeline service uses something called a CodeStar connection to access our Git repository. And you'll see here in a little bit how we set that up. It's a little bit of a manual process, but I'll show you that here later in the video. But it's important to point out that the CodePipeline service does not use that AWS secret that we set up. It does not use that personal access token. It uses a different authentication called the CodeStar connection to communicate with our GitHub account. Okay, well, let's go into the Cloudformation service. And just like our previous videos, one of the first things that we're going to do here is we are going to deploy a Cloudformation template. And that will, of course, create a stack for us. So we'll create a stack, a new stack, and the template that we're going to deploy is in our class S3 bucket. It's called app CodePipeline template.yaml. So we'll select that template file, and it's asking for a stack name, and we'll call this one the Python project stack. For the parameters, there's a few different parameters we have to provide. We have to provide the GitHub branch name, which is master, and we have to provide the repository name, which is going to be, in this case, my personal account name for GitHub / Python-project, which is our project name. We have the auto scaling group size 2, web server AMI, web server type. So this is going to basically launch the exact same infrastructure resources that the code deploy template launch. So it's creating a VPC, an Elastic Load Balancer, an auto scaling group that is going to deploy a set of web servers. And if you recall, there is a user data script which is bootstrapping those web servers and installing some software components like the code deploy agent on those servers. Okay, this looks good. So I'm going to click on next, scroll down to the bottom, click next again. We're selecting all the defaults, scroll down and click the checkbox saying that we're going to acknowledge the creation of IAM resources. Click on the create stack button and our stack is now being created. I'll go ahead and pause the video once again here because it'll take 5 minutes or so to launch all these resources, and once those are done, we will continue. Okay, our CloudFormation stack deployment is complete, and you should be able to see lots of different resources that were created as part of this stack. This is the biggest stack yet that we have deployed in this lecture, because it deploys all sorts of resources: the CodeBuild, the CodeDeploy, the CodePipeline services. Everything is packed into this template, along with, of course, all the compute resources and VPC resources that we have described before. Okay, well, when we launched this stack, then we built our first code pipeline. So if we go to the CodePipeline service and look at our pipelines, we'll see that there is a pipeline defined there. We have a Python project pipeline. But interestingly enough, it's failed. There's a failure state. So when you launch the pipeline, when you create it for the first time, then AWS will try to launch the pipeline. But this pipeline has failed. And if I click into the pipeline, we'll see that the pipeline consists of multiple stages. We have a source stage, a build stage, and a deploy stage. The source stage will retrieve our source code from GitHub. The build stage will use AWS CodeBuild then to build our application and create an output artifact. And then the deploy stage will use the AWS deploy service to deploy that artifact in that web application on our EC2 instances. Well, it's failed at the source stage. And if I click on this little details link, a dialog box pops up, and it tells me that the connection, the CodeStar connection, is not in an available state. The CodeStar connection. Well, remember I mentioned that the code pipeline is going to use something called a CodeStar connection to communicate with GitHub. And that connection was something that was actually created by our CloudFormation template. But that connection hasn't been configured yet because we have to manually configure the connection to our GitHub repository. So if I go to this settings link under CodePipeline and click on connections, what I'll see here is a connection called the GitHub connection. And you can see that the status of that connection is in a pending state. And so what I will do is I'll click on that connection, and you can see that it says, there's an information box here that says, your connection is pending. Choose update pending connection to finish creating the connection. So I'll click on the update pending connection button. And when I do that, then a window pops up, and it's asking to connect to into GitHub. So what I want to do here is install a new app. And so I'm going to connect, and it's going to connect to my account. So I want to install a new app here. And now my connection is available. So, and I have done this process before. So if you do this process for the first time, what you might find is that there is a, there's another series of dialog boxes that pop up asking you to authenticate into your GitHub account to verify that you want to add that integration into GitHub. But now this connection is available, so this is the status that we're looking for. And we can go back to our developer tools and the code pipeline to see the pipeline that we have set up. Before I run the pipeline, I just want to note that I'd like to take a look at some of these other services that were configured for us. Take a look at the CodeBuild service first. If I click on CodeBuild and build projects, you'll see that there's an app build project that was created in here. This is using AWS CodePipeline. So AWS CodePipeline is going to automatically manage and trigger this CodeBuild project. And also, if we go and look at the code deploy service and look at the applications, you can see that there's a Python project web application that's also defined in the deploy service. And this will also be automatically triggered by and managed by the CodePipeline service. So CodePipeline is gluing these various services together. So let's go back to our pipeline project, and we'll select the code pipeline. And what we want to do here in this case is the first time we tried to run it, it failed. We're going to try to retry running this pipeline. So we're going to trigger the pipeline process again. And you can see, like, on the right-hand side, it will show kind of the status of each of these pipeline stages from top to bottom. If I click on them, each pipeline stage, you can get some information about the pipeline and how it's set up. You can see, like, this pipeline stage, the get source, has succeeded, so it was able to access GitHub and retrieve the project files. Now it's actually building the files in AWS CodeBuild service. If we went over to CodeBuild and we clicked on build projects, and which we won't do right now, but if you did that, you'd see that CodeBuild project is actually running. It's performing the build based upon the build spec YAML file that is in place in the source code repository. So it's building. It's in progress. This here is a link to the source code that's being built, and that build stage has now succeeded. And then finally, it's going to go to the deploy stage. It's executing deployment. We'll go over there and take a look at that deploy stage, because as you recall, that takes a little while. So you can see this deploy stage is in progress. If I click on it, then once again, we can see that each of the EC2 instances is going to be updated. So I will pause the video. Well, I'm going to go back to the code pipeline here. And just put this view up here again, just showing the different stages and the progress of our pipeline. And I'll pause the video here because it's going to take maybe 10 minutes to update our EC2 instances with that newly built web application. Okay, our pipeline deploy stage has finally succeeded. And if we go back to our CloudFormation stack and look at the outputs section of the stack, you'll see that there is an elastic load balancer endpoint. That's the endpoint for our web application. And if we open up a new tab and click on that link, what we'll see is a web page for a fictitious company called Veracity Industries, products that you can believe in. And so this is the very simple web application that was deployed onto our web server. So again, we started with a Git repository. The source code from that Git repository was pulled into a CodeBuild project by the CodePipeline. The CodeBuild project then built that application, packaged it up, and created an output artifact in an S3 bucket. Then the CodePipeline triggered a deployment of that new artifact using code deploy, and that artifact was then deployed onto our web server. So we took a look at the build spec and the app spec file earlier to understand, how CodeBuild and code deploy would actually build the application, would deploy the application on the EC2 instances. So that's the CodePipeline service in a nutshell. It glues these other components together and allows us to build out a pipeline. Now this pipeline is very simple. It only has 3 stages. Our pipeline could be much longer than this, and it could use, we could have an automated testing stage. We could have a manual approval stage. So there are all kinds of other stages that we could integrate into this pipeline. But this one is very simple, just for educational purposes. The one last thing I want to do here is quickly walk through the CloudFormation template that was used to deploy the stack. So if we look at the CloudFormation template, and this is the CodePipeline template, we see that there's a number of input parameters. We've seen all these input parameters before, for the most part. In previous stacks, we have an artifact bucket and an artifact bucket policy. These are exactly the same as our previous stacks that we launched. We have a new resource here called the CodeStar connection, and this is going to set up a connection to a GitHub provider. And you notice that when CloudFormation creates this resource, that it's really put into a pending state. It's not automatically activated. That's because there's no way for CloudFormation to provide it with any sort of credentials. So it puts it in the pending state, and then we have to manually go in to that connection in the AWS Web Console and then enable that connection and provide it with access to GitHub. Then we have the VPC, subnet, the elastic load balancer, the auto scaling group resources, all these different resources defined in the template. These are all identical basically to the previous configuration that we saw. The one difference that I'll point out in this user data script, by the way, which bootstraps the EC2 instances that are launched, is that this user data script does not install Nginx. So there's no Nginx web server installed, the Python web application is utilizing a built-in web server, a Python-based web server. So it's not using Nginx in this case, and so that was not installed as part of the bootstrapping process. But the code deploy agent, as you can see, was installed on the EC2 instance. We keep scrolling down. Again, all this stuff is pretty much the same. And then we come down to our CodeBuild project, which is very similar to the CodeBuild project resource definition that we saw in our previous video. One of the big differences is that if you look at the artifacts property here, and if you look at the source property, you see that both are referencing CodePipeline. And that's because this is wired into a CodePipeline. And the CodePipeline is really taking over control of what sort of artifact is going to be created and what source is going to be used for the code build process. So that's kind of being injected by and managed by the code pipeline. So we'll keep scrolling down. We have a role that's being created for the code build process, and then we have our code deploy resource that's defined. This again is very similar to the previous video example that you saw. Code deploy, of course, is also going to be managed by the code pipeline. And keep scrolling down. And then finally, we get to the code pipeline resource definition. So that, and this is called the pipeline resource. This is defining the various stages of the pipeline. So you see that in the properties section, we define an artifact store. That artifact store is our S3 bucket. We also define a role that the code pipeline service will assume. And it assumes that role so that it can execute the various stages of the pipeline. And we'll take a look at that shortly. Then we have a stages property, and this is really where all the magic happens. This is where we define each individual stage within the pipeline. So this is a list of different stages. The first stage is called the source stage, and the source stage has an actions property, which is a list of actions. You can think of actions as being sort of like individual steps that are executed within a stage. In this case, we have one action, which is called get source, and we have an action type, which is a source action, and this action type is going to use the CodeStar source connection provider. So this is basically saying that we're going to use the CodeStar connection credentials to go out to our GitHub repository. So here we have a reference to the GitHub repository name. We have a reference to the specific branch of the repository that we want to pull source code from. We have detect changes as true, which means that it will set up a webhook on the repository, so that if there's any changes that occur, then this pipeline will automatically be triggered by changes to that GitHub repository. And then there's an output artifact from this stage, and you'll see this is a common pattern where you have a stage that creates an output artifact, and then the next stage will have an input artifact. So it's going to take the output artifact from the previous stage. So our source code stage has an output artifact called source code. What this is doing is basically packaging up all the source code. So the pipeline is going to download that source code and package it up in an artifact called source code. Then we come to the next stage, which is the build stage. And that build stage is going to use an input artifact called source code. So it's going to use that source code artifact that was created by the previous stage. And this action type here is a build action, and it's going to leverage the CodeBuild provider. And for the configuration property for the build, it's referencing our CodeBuild project resource. So this is what is essentially tying together the code pipeline and that CodeBuild project definition. So it will provide that CodeBuild project with this input artifact, and then out of that CodeBuild is going to come an output artifact. And that output artifact is going to be called the code artifact. You can see here it's called code artifact. And then that is passed into our deploy stage. And our deploy stage is using an input artifact, which is that code artifact from the previous stage. So hopefully you can kind of see this pattern now where one stage has an output artifact, and then the next stage can use that the output artifact from the previous stage as an input artifact. So this stage has an action type category of deploy, and it's using the code deploy provider. Under the configuration, we are specifying we're specifying the application, so the code deploy application and the code deploy deployment group here as well. So this is what is tying the pipeline to our code deploy definition. So this is a really important resource. This is really the key here in this template, this pipeline resource. It's defining that each stage of that pipeline that you saw being executed by the pipeline service. If we scroll down here towards the end, we have a code pipeline role. And this role is actually pretty involved. So we have to basically describe all the policies that are required for the code pipeline to execute all of the stages defined in the pipeline. For example, there is a code star connections use connection action that is allowed, and that's what that's allowing the code pipeline to use that code star connection resource that we set up, which holds the credentials that are used to access GitHub. And then the code pipeline can access our S3 artifact bucket. It can call the code deploy service and create new deployments. It's allowed to make changes to EC2, elastic load balancers, and auto scaling groups. And it's also allowed to initiate builds in the CodeBuild project as well. So, and then it ends up here in the template at the very end. We have a couple outputs like our elastic load balancer endpoint. So this is a longer template. It's almost 500 lines of code. And as you can see, there's a lot that's going on here. But hopefully, by watching the previous videos, you can see how we sort of built up this template by taking pieces from the other templates and combining them into a larger more complex project, and this is a very useful project, right? This process of building software code or pulling software code from a repository, building an output artifact, and then automatically deploying that output artifact into some sort of environment in the cloud. This is a very, very common pattern that we do in industry every single day. And CodePipeline is a great service to help us accomplish that process. Well, I hope that this video has been interesting and that you have a better understanding of how this pipeline process works and the power of code pipelines. And just like previous projects, if you want to, when you go to delete this CloudFormation stack, you need to go and make sure that the artifact S3 bucket is empty first before you delete your stack. So once you empty it, you'll be able to delete your stack just fine, and it will delete all the resources created in this project. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video and you're looking forward to the next one. Thanks.